We begin with Congress. It's back next week facing more calls for new restrictions on guns. We now know that the gunman responsible for the most recent mass shooting in Odessa, Texas, failed an FBI background check and bought the gun he used from a private seller. The New York Times reports that inside the White House, the issue of new gun restrictions has largely been theoretical, in part because the White House has new polls showing that gun control is politically problematic for the president. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, said this week on a radio talk show that he won't bring up any gun bill unless President Trump supports it.
If the president took a position on a bill so that we knew we would actually be making a law and not just having serial votes, I'd be happy to put it on the floor.
Joining me tonight, Peter Baker, Chief White House Correspondent for the New York Times, Yamiche Alcindor, White House Correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, Philip Rucker, White House Bureau Chief for the Washington Post, and Abby Livingston, Washington Bureau Chief for the Texas Tribune. So, Abby, let me start with you. We know about this background check issue. It brought it much more into the fore. Could Congress pass a background check bill?
I would guess it's highly unlikely. And what I see going on in the state of Texas, which I think is reflective of the rest of the country, is I put out a call to a friend in Midland, which is where part of this shooting got started. And I said, is there any change in sentiment on the ground of the people who actually felt this, who had to go get shelter? And he said, absolutely not. But on the flip side, you go across the state of Texas and you go to Houston, and that is the suburbs of Houston is where these elections and the House races are being fought. And Democrats think they have a real shot at luring Republican women over to their side to vote for their candidates. And so I just don't see it happening. I think several members of my delegation have actually been in a mass shooting at the baseball practice. And so if that didn't move them on the issue, I don't see how any other mass shootings will.
More mass shootings in Texas. This is, what, 3 of them so far. Has that changed the views of the Texas delegation in any way?
They're not outwardly getting in front of this week. What I can say is Senator John Cornyn, who's an extremely powerful member of the Senate, there was a church shooting several years ago in Sutherland Springs, and it really did seem to rock him. And so he did get involved in some smaller changes, but nothing sweeping, and he was successful at it.
Yeah, these were changes that required federal agencies to do a better job of giving information, disqualifying information to the FBI for background checks. But what about the president, Peter? Does he actually believe in any kind of gun legislation, or is it going to be a total dead letter for him?
Well, you know, what's interesting, we've seen this with him before, of course. In the immediate aftermath of a terrible tragedy like that, his first instinct is to think about gun legislation. He's from New York. He may be a conservative Republican now, but he has been a Democrat in the past. I don't think this is a red line for him, and he was open to the idea. And then after time passes, after the NRA weighs in, after the pollsters weigh in, after he, considers what his base is going to think about it, he tends to back off. Now, he may come up with something. It's possible we get some kind of legislation of a probably cosmetic basis through, but I think Abby's right. I think if it didn't happen in a major way after Parkland, after Newtown, after the congressional baseball game, what makes now any different?
You know, every time one of these happens, someone in Congress, like the Speaker or someone, says enough is enough. This will be different. But do you get any sense at the White House that things will be any different or ever will be after one of these?
The president was really strong in the first couple of days after those back-to-back shootings during that tragic weekend where there were shootings in both Ohio and Texas. He said, I'm going to bring people together and get them to do things that they haven't done in the past. Then what we saw was a slow backtracking of the president. He admitted to being on the phone with Wayne LaPierre, the chief of the NRA. I put the question to the president on the White House lawn, are you also speaking to mass shooting victims about what they want? I've talked to a number of them in Ohio who told me they do want to see some sort of change. And the president said, I went and visited them at the hospital and they love me. But he would not say that he was having any sort of real constructive conversations with mass shooting victims. And what that tells me is that the president is listening to the NRA and having deep conversations with Republicans and making political calculations, and that usually leads to inaction on the Republican side when it comes to gun control or gun law changes.
Philip, what about the NRA? It's having its own problem, but in terms of its influence on the White House or indeed on Congress, is it still as powerful as ever?
It's very powerful, Pete, at the White House and with Republicans in Congress. And you're right, there's a lot of scrutiny on the NRA institutionally. They're having difficulties as an organization, but they still represent a really powerful part of Trump's coalition and of the Republican voting bloc. And that's why you see the president so reluctant to provide that sort of political cover and presidential leadership to push for any meaningful gun laws. I do, however, think it's likely that the White House will put forward a set of proposals probably next week or soon thereafter when Congress gets back that deal with mental health issues, that might deal with capital punishment, other things that would address mass shootings without actually changing gun laws.
But no restrict. You all agree that it's unlikely Congress will change the gun laws in any way?
Absolutely correct.
Yeah.
All right. So we saw something else that's going to troubling to some members of Congress. The fact that the Defense Department said this week that work on 127 military construction projects will be delayed because nearly $4 billion is being transferred from the Pentagon budget to build parts of the border wall. This move affects projects in nearly half the states. So is there anything that Congress can do to change this, or is this a done deal for this budget year?
The Democrats are trying to figure out what to do. And I think one of the most important things to remember in this is that the Speaker of the House has been in that chamber for over 30 years. Her father was a member. And Trump has just taken a shot at the House of Representatives' singular power of the purse. And this is extremely troubling to Democrats. Their weekly address this week is about this issue. But whether or not they're able to pull something together amid the funding fight that we face every September is an open question.
Well, they can't change it for this fiscal year, right? And there was a court challenge, and the Supreme Court threw it out, saying that the parties that sued in California, environmental groups and some communities, didn't have any legal standing. And that sort of seemed to end this, to make it clear the president had the power to do this. So what about next year? Will Congress try to put this money back into the budget and try to get these projects funded?
Well, the question is whether they want President Trump to pay a price for it, right? In other words, is it in the Democrats' interest to say we're going to be the ones who rescue these military families who are not going to have a new middle school, for instance, on their base or something like that? Or is it to their interest in a political way to say your president is the one who did that. If you want to change that, you have to vote him out. This being Washington, I would vote for, my guess would be the political answer. But the argument that the president has actually penalized people who are normally part of his base, the military community, is one that resonates with the Democrats. The difference, of course, the president's going to say, look, I've given the military a lot of money. A lot more money than Obama did, and the question is whether that overcomes the concerns about these particular projects.
So a showdown over funding the border wall, shut the government down for a while. Are we going to see that again? Is the president going to again ask for more money to the wall, and Congress is not going to give it to him?
We very well may. I don't think the president's going to stop asking for money for that border wall. And here's why. It was the signature promise of his 2016 campaign, and he knows the election, his re-election is now 14 months away. He's got to show some movement in terms of constructing that wall. He feels he needs to deliver on that pledge. He's not getting the money he needs for it from the Democrats in Congress, and I think he's going to continue demanding for that money, but also continue these sort of budget maneuvers that we saw this week and may see in the future, where he's trying to reallocate money, and to Abby's point, doing so in a way that Democrats allege is unconstitutional.
And one Democratic leadership source I spoke to today said that there's a real reluctance to backfill this money into the military for these projects because it only encourages the president to continue to do this again.
Well, that's cutting off your nose to spite your own face, though, isn't it? And there are some interesting people that are affected by this, members of Congress. I mean, this is normally the thing that they would howl about. For example, Fort Campbell, Kentucky, in Mitch McConnell's home state, but he seems not to be objecting to what the president's doing here.
Yeah, what's remarkable is how much the Republican Party is in lockstep with President Trump in a way that we haven't seen actually very often. I mean, a lot of presidents have loyal members of their party, but they often quarrel even with members of their own party about issues like home state projects and things like that. We don't see that with President Trump. He has instilled a discipline or a fear or a loyalty or whatever word you want to find in this Republican Party, so they might stand up to him from time to time on points of principle, but they're not going to get in his face. They don't think that's a constructive way of influencing him.
Well, I think what's most striking about the loyalty that Peter's describing is the fact that they're choosing to side with the president over a middle school that is overcrowded, over a middle school where children have to eat in the library because they can't fit into the cafeteria all at one time, where teachers are having to use their own money to educate students. And these are the children that are the children of service members. These that one principal told Helene Cooper in the New York Times that these are the children that are bearing the burden of the wars that we're fighting. So it's an incredible thing that the Republican Party is sticking with the president, but it shows you why they stick with the president on such other controversial things.